Hello, my name is Jack Maher. My book is called Poppy, a novel about a colorful Colorado life. It's a work of historical fiction. It's about one of the pioneers of the Denver Art Museum's Native Arts Department. Way back in the early 20th century, it was known as the Indian Arts Department. This man's name was Eric Douglas, and his whole goal in life was to elevate Native American art and artists. Douglas would ride horseback with his father throughout the great American Southwest, including the Four Corners region, where he befriended many of these creators. One of them was a very talented Hopi potter named Nampeo. Nampeo lived in Hano, First Mesa, one of three centers of Hopi reservation life. My book has a conversation between Eric and Nampeo. He convinces her to make him a seed jar which he can put in the Denver Art Museum. And he also asks if he can document the process in a sketchbook so that her techniques and her work can be preserved for future generations. Let me just set the scene for you a little bit before I read this excerpt. At this point in her life, Nampeo was essentially blind. An insidious eye disease had scarred her corneas, so she depended on her daughter Annie to help find the distinctive yellow clay that she liked to use, which could be located around the mesa. Nampeo also depends on Annie to help cleanse the clay of impurities by essentially kneading it with her feet. Also, a big canteen of water is near her, and unknown to Eric, Nampeo is motivated to make this jar because of a vision she had from a couple of important figures in Hopi culture, Spider Woman and Spotted Eagle. So with that, here is my excerpt. Annie disappeared into a back room while Eric retreated to a corner, pulled out a leather-bound notebook, and patted down the pockets of his white muslin work shirt for a pencil. As familiar as he was with Nampeo's methods, he was determined to document them as thoroughly as he could through words and sketches. He had no idea how his chronicle of the old potter would fit the needs of the Denver Art Museum, but he sensed it would be important. Nampeo sunk her mind back into the vision she'd been given the night before and began softly singing as she worked. Her voice was high and thin. Eric recognized the chant of the eagle dance. The eagle rises, the wings swoop upward. Nampeo massaged the clay as if it were bread dough, even though it pained her arthritic fingers. Again and again, she squeezed the yellow mass as little puffs of air scented with the smell of thousands of years of earth, white fur, juniper, and pinyon whispered up into her crinkled face. High toward the sky, the great bird moves. She continued working the clay, picking out more pebbles, tiny bits of stick and dirt that had escaped Annie's kneading. The work was tedious, but Nampeo knew it would lessen the chances the piece would break in drying or firing. The old potter paused to feel for two pieces of sandstone that lay next to her flat work surface and rubbed them together to create a fine sand which she then added to the clay, enriching it. She then dipped her hands into the canteen, flinging a spray of droplets to the mixture. A small rainbow flashed briefly from her fingers. His plumes are filled with prayers. Earth and heaven are one. The constant massaging turned into slaps, thumps, and pounding, as Nampeo broke tiny bubbles that had formed on the surface. Vibrations from her work rattled the shelves of finished bowls and jars that lined the whitewashed walls. It even raised little currents of fine dust that had settled on a row of kachina dolls that shook as if dancing. The eagle rises. At last, the clay was ready. Nampeo slumped back onto her blanket, exhausted and sweat-soaked. She waited for her fluttering heart to slow and then tried to flex the ache out of each hand. Each piece of pottery she'd ever made had cost a bit of her vitality, and she wondered how much more this seed jar might be taking. But she knew there was a reason for last night's vision of the spotted eagle and Spider Woman, and she wanted to capture it before it faded from memory. The urgency of it gave her new strength. Across the room, Eric had a concerned look. Nampio looked completely spent. Her face was the color of ash. But just as he was about to rise up and find Annie, the old potter straightened. He watched as her hands dipped again into the water canteen, fluttered up onto her mass of thick white hair, and gathered some of it into a wet knot above her forehead. Eric realized this was her ingenious way of keeping cool as she proceeded with the next steps of her creation. Nampio reached for a chunk of the clay and flattened it into a base, then broke off another piece and rolled it back and forth between her hands until a long, slender tube started taking shape. Expertly, she wound it up and around, pressing gently as she worked so the tube would attach. To this, she added a second tube, then a third, until she was satisfied with the size and shape it was taking. Picking up a gourd, she smoothed the sides of the layered tubes inside and out as the seed jar of her imagination started to reveal itself. Near the opening, Nampio pinched out a set of bulges that mystified Eric until he realized they were decorations meant to look like kernels of corn. He did his best to sketch the design in his notebook, taking care to include dimensions. The old potter worked so quickly and with such confidence, Eric had to remind himself that Nampio was doing this not by eyesight, but by instinct and touch. He also figured she was relying on an inner artistic wisdom earned through thousands of hours of crafting her wares dating back to when she was a little girl learning at her mother's side. Annie reappeared, and without being told, took the jar outside to dry in the sun. Nampio took advantage of the pause to nap in a shaft of sunlight where she sat. The only sounds in the room were Nampio's slow, steady breathing and Eric's pencil as it skittered across the page.